Quit your job or you are no longer part of this family. My mother's words cut through the private dining room like a blade. And for a moment, the entire world seemed to tilt on its axis. Around me, 23 members of my extended family sat in absolute silence, their faces a mixture of anticipation and judgment, waiting to see how I would respond to the ultimatum that would define the rest of my life. They had no idea that I had been preparing for this exact moment for the past 4 months, or that the career they were demanding I abandon was about to become the instrument of their own reckoning. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The Riverside Estate was exactly the kind of venue my parents chose when they wanted to make a statement. Perched on the banks of Lake Washington just outside Seattle, the restaurant commanded sweeping views of the water through floor-to-ceiling windows that reflected the late afternoon sun in brilliant shards of gold and crimson. The private dining room my father had reserved could accommodate 30 guests comfortably, with its vaulted ceilings, crystal chandeliers imported from Prague, and a wine collection that required a sommelier's consultation to navigate. The reservation had been made 3 months in advance. The menu had been curated specifically for this gathering. Every detail had been orchestrated with the same meticulous control my parents applied to every aspect of their lives and, by extension, mine. I had arrived exactly on time, neither early enough to seem anxious nor late enough to appear disrespectful. The parking lot had been filled with the vehicles that represented my family's particular brand of success. My Uncle Richard's Tesla Model X sat beside my Aunt Catherine's Mercedes SUV. My cousin Brandon's Porsche was parked near my grandmother's chauffeur-driven Cadillac. And there, closest to the entrance, was my father's Range Rover, positioned as always to assert dominance even in something as mundane as parking arrangements. My own car, a 7-year-old Honda Civic that I had purchased with my own money and maintained with my own earnings, looked almost apologetic among these symbols of wealth and status. The hostess had recognized my last name immediately when I entered. The Thornton family was well known in Seattle's social circles, the kind of family that appeared in the society pages of the Seattle Times, and made generous donations to the right charitable causes. My father, Gerald Thornton, had built a commercial real estate development company that bore his name and had transformed several neighborhoods in the greater Seattle area. My mother, Patricia Thornton, served on the boards of 3 nonprofit organizations and hosted an annual gala that raised substantial funds for arts education. They were respected, admired, and considered pillars of the community. What people did not see was the iron control they exerted over their children, the conditional nature of their love, or the way they wielded approval and disapproval like weapons to shape behavior and crush independence. As I walked through the main dining area toward the private room, I caught sight of my reflection in one of the ornamental mirrors that lined the hallway. I had dressed carefully for this dinner, choosing a tailored navy dress that my mother would approve of, modest heels that added height without seeming ostentatious, and simple jewelry that suggested good taste without extravagance. My dark hair was pulled back in a professional style that I wore to work, and my makeup was understated but polished. I looked like the daughter my parents had raised me to be, the obedient child who understood her place in the family hierarchy and accepted it without question. They had no idea that the woman wearing this carefully chosen armor had spent the past 4 months documenting their darkest secrets. The door to the private dining room stood open, and I could hear the sound of conversation and laughter spilling into the hallway. I paused for just a moment, taking a deep breath and steadying myself for what was about to occur. My phone buzzed in my purse, a text message from my best friend Rachel, who was the only person outside this room who knew what I was walking into. The message was simple and direct. "You've got this. Remember why you're doing this. I'm here when it's over." I allowed myself a small smile, slipped the phone back into my purse and stepped through the doorway. The room fell silent the moment I entered, 23 pairs of eyes turning toward me with expressions that ranged from curiosity to barely concealed hostility. My father stood at the head of the long table that dominated the space, a glass of bourbon already in his hand despite the early hour. My mother sat to his right, her posture perfect, her expression carefully neutral in the way that always preceded one of her calculated performances. My older sister Victoria was positioned beside our mother, her designer outfit probably costing more than I earned in a month, her smile sharp enough to draw blood. My younger brother Christopher lounged in his chair with the casual arrogance of someone who had never been denied anything in his life, his eyes tracking me with the same assessment he might give to a business competitor. The extended family filled the remaining seats in a carefully orchestrated arrangement that reflected the family power structure. My father's brother Richard sat near the head of the table with his wife Catherine and their 3 children. My mother's sister Caroline occupied the opposite side with her husband Thomas and their 2 daughters. My grandmother, my father's mother Elizabeth, held the position of honor directly across from my father, her aged face set in lines of stern disapproval that I had known since childhood. Various cousins, a few family friends who had been elevated to near family status, and my mother's assistant rounded out the gathering. It was an audience, I realized with sudden clarity. They had not been invited simply to share a meal. They had been summoned to witness my humiliation. "Sarah, darling, you made it." My mother's voice carried across the room with false warmth that would have fooled anyone who did not know her well. I knew better. I had learned to read the subtle indicators of her moods through years of careful observation born of self-preservation. The slight tension at the corners of her mouth indicated displeasure. The way her fingers gripped her wine glass suggested barely controlled emotion. The pitch of her voice, just slightly higher than her natural register, revealed the performance aspect of this greeting. She was angry, but she was containing it for maximum effect later. I moved to the empty seat that had been left for me, positioned strategically at the opposite end of the table from my father, as far from the center of power as the room's configuration allowed. "Hello, Mother. Father. Everyone." I kept my voice steady and pleasant, nodding acknowledgement to the assembled family members as I took my seat. A server appeared immediately to pour water and offer wine, which I accepted with a small nod of thanks. The wine was a Napa Valley Cabernet that probably cost more per bottle than my monthly grocery budget, but I took only a small sip and set the glass aside. I would need complete clarity for what was coming. The conversation resumed in fits and starts, people making awkward small talk about traffic, weather, and other inconsequential topics while waiting for whatever drama my parents had orchestrated. My cousin Jennifer asked about her recent vacation to Maui with excruciating detail about resort amenities. My uncle Richard discussed a new property development with the kind of self-importance that suggested everyone should be fascinated by commercial zoning regulations. My sister Victoria mentioned her upcoming feature in Seattle Magazine's annual profile of the city's most influential young professionals, managing to make it sound like a casual afterthought while ensuring everyone heard about this achievement. I participated minimally, offering appropriate responses when directly addressed, but mostly observing the dynamics around me. I watched my father check his watch twice, a sign of impatience with the social preliminaries. I noticed my mother exchange a meaningful glance with Victoria, some kind of signal I could not interpret. I saw my grandmother studying me with the kind of intense scrutiny that suggested she was cataloging my flaws for later discussion. And I felt the weight of Christopher's gaze, my brother watching me with an expression I could not quite read but that seemed to contain both curiosity and something darker. The first course arrived, an artfully arranged salad with ingredients I could not identify and a vinaigrette that probably required a culinary degree to prepare. The servers moved with practiced efficiency, placing plates before each guest with choreographed precision. My father waited until everyone had been served before picking up his fork, a signal that we were now permitted to eat. The gesture encapsulated everything about our family dynamics. Even something as simple as beginning a meal required his authorization. "So, Sarah," my Aunt Caroline's voice carried across the table with syrupy sweetness that immediately put me on guard. "Your mother mentioned that you have been quite busy with work lately. It must be exhausting, all those hours you put in." I recognized the opening salvo of what was to come. Caroline had always served as my mother's proxy for delivering veiled criticisms, allowing my mother to maintain the appearance of maternal support, while ensuring the disapproval was communicated. I set down my fork carefully and met her gaze directly. "The work is demanding, but it is also incredibly fulfilling. I find purpose in what I do." "Purpose?" My father's voice cut through the pleasantries like a thunderclap, and the entire table fell silent. He had not shouted. Gerald Thornton never needed to raise his voice to command attention or assert authority. His tone carried enough weight to silence a room through sheer force of will. "That is an interesting word choice. Tell me, Sarah, What purpose exactly do you find in spending 80 hours a week at a government office making a fraction of what you could earn in the private sector? Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The attack had begun earlier than I expected, but I was ready for it. I had known this dinner was not a simple family gathering the moment my mother called 2 weeks ago with the invitation. "We need to have a family discussion," she had said, her voice carrying the particular tone that indicated the discussion would actually be a verdict delivered after a trial I was not permitted to attend. "Your father and I have some concerns about the direction of your life. We think it would be good to address them with the whole family present." I had considered declining the invitation. I had considered confronting them privately before this gathering could occur. I had considered a dozen different approaches before settling on the strategy that brought me to this moment. I would attend, I would listen, and I would watch them reveal themselves completely before I made my move. "I work for the Securities and Exchange Commission," I said evenly, addressing not just my father but the entire table. "I investigate financial crimes, securities fraud, and market manipulation. The work is not about maximizing personal income. It is about protecting investors and ensuring market integrity." How noble! Victoria's contribution dripped with sarcasm. "And how convenient that your nobility requires the rest of us to support you." I turned to look at my sister, taking in her expensive outfit, her professional manicure, her designer handbag visible on the empty chair beside her. Victoria worked for our father's company in a vice president role that had been created specifically for her, drawing a salary that bore no relationship to her actual contributions or competencies. She lived in a condominium our parents had purchased for her in downtown Seattle, drove a car they leased for her, and spent money she had never earned on a lifestyle she had never funded. And yet she had the audacity to suggest that I was the one being supported by the family. "I support myself, Victoria. I live on my salary, pay my own rent and manage my own expenses. I have asked the family for nothing." My voice remained calm, but I felt the anger beginning to simmer beneath the surface. This was the narrative they had constructed, I realized. They had told the family that I was somehow a burden, a dependent, a drain on family resources. The lie was so audacious it was almost impressive. "You asked for nothing because you knew we would refuse." My mother's interjection was delivered with perfect timing, and I understood suddenly that this was a rehearsed performance. They had coordinated their attacks, assigned roles, planned the escalation. "After we paid for your education at Princeton, after we provided you with every opportunity and advantage, you chose to pursue a career that is frankly beneath your potential. And now you expect us to simply accept this choice without comment or concern." I graduated from Princeton 6 years ago. I paid for my graduate degree at Georgetown myself through scholarships and part-time work. I have been financially independent since I was 24 years old. What exactly am I expecting you to accept? I could feel the careful control I had maintained beginning to slip, but I held it together through sheer force of will. I needed them to continue. I needed them to escalate. I needed them to reveal the true nature of this gathering. My father stood abruptly, the motion causing everyone else to freeze. He was a tall man, over 6 feet, and he used his physical presence as another tool of intimidation. From his position at the head of the table, he could literally look down on everyone else in the room, a spatial arrangement that reflected his view of his position in the family hierarchy. His face had flushed with the anger that I knew could erupt into volcanic rage if sufficiently provoked, but he maintained his composure with the same iron control he applied to all aspects of his life. "What you are expecting," he said, each word measured and deliberate, "is for this family to stand by and watch while you waste your life chasing petty bureaucrats and small-time criminals. What you are expecting is for us to smile and nod while you throw away every advantage we gave you. What you are expecting is for us to accept that a daughter of mine works in a government cubicle earning a government salary investigating people who are actually building wealth and creating jobs." The mask had slipped. For just a moment, my father's true feelings had emerged from beneath the veneer of parental concern. He was not worried about my happiness or my fulfillment. He was embarrassed by my career choice. In his world, in the circles where he operated and sought validation, having a daughter who worked for a regulatory agency investigating financial crimes was a source of shame. It suggested that his child had chosen to align with enforcement rather than enterprise, with regulation rather than ambition. It marked me as someone who had rejected the values he held most dear, and in doing so had rejected him. I investigate securities fraud and market manipulation, I repeated, my voice steady despite the rage building inside me. I protect investors from predatory practices and ensure market integrity. If you find that embarrassing, perhaps you should examine why the idea of financial regulation makes you so uncomfortable. The room went completely silent. Several of my relatives shifted uncomfortably in their seats. My grandmother's eyes narrowed dangerously. My Uncle Richard stared at his plate with sudden fascination, and my mother's face drained of color as she recognized what I had just implied. My father's hand tightened on his bourbon glass, his knuckles going white with the pressure. When he spoke again, his voice was very quiet, which was infinitely more dangerous than if he had shouted. You will not speak to me that way. You will not disrespect me in front of this family. And you will not continue down this path that brings shame to the Thornton name. Then what exactly would you like me to do? I asked, though I already knew the answer. This entire dinner had been constructed to deliver a specific ultimatum, and we were finally approaching that moment. My mother stood now, moving to stand beside my father in a show of united parental authority. She had composed herself, her face once again a mask of maternal concern that would have been convincing to anyone who did not know her. Sarah, we love you. Everything we have done has been for your benefit and your future. But this career path you have chosen is not acceptable. It reflects poorly on our family, it limits your prospects, and frankly, it suggests a kind of judgment toward the business community that we find deeply troubling. You work for a government agency that investigates successful people, Victoria added, clearly emboldened by our parents' escalation. Do you have any idea how that looks? Do you understand what people think when they learn that Gerald Thornton's daughter works for the SEC? They think we must have something to hide. They think you are some kind of crusader against wealth and success. Or, Christopher interjected with the lazy drawl he used when delivering what he considered a particularly cutting observation, they think you are not smart enough to make it in the real world, so you had to settle for a government job with a guaranteed salary and benefits. The attacks were coming from all sides now, each member of my immediate family contributing their perspective on my failings and inadequacies. I sat quietly, letting them speak, documenting every word in my memory for the accounting that would come later. Around us, the extended family members watched with varying degrees of discomfort or agreement. Some, like my Uncle Richard, seemed genuinely troubled by the hostility of the attack. Others, like my cousin Brandon, nodded along with obvious approval. My grandmother simply watched, her expression unreadable but her silence speaking volumes about where her loyalties lay. We have given this a great deal of thought, my mother continued, her voice taking on the reasonable tone she used when delivering ultimatums disguised as suggestions. Your father and I have discussed your situation extensively with the family, and we are all in agreement about what needs to happen next. Here it comes, I thought. The moment they had orchestrated this entire gathering to deliver. I gripped my wine glass, not to drink but to have something to hold, something to keep my hands steady and visible rather than clenched in fists beneath the table. You need to resign from the SEC, my father stated flatly. You need to leave that job and come work for Thornton Development in a role appropriate to your education and capabilities. We will start you at a salary commensurate with your degree and experience, far more than the government pays you. You will have real responsibility, real opportunities for advancement, and the chance to actually build wealth instead of investigating those who do. And if I refuse? The question emerged more quietly than I intended, but everyone heard it clearly in the silent room. My mother's expression hardened, the mask of concern finally dropping to reveal the steel beneath. Then you need to understand that there will be consequences. This family does not support members who work against our interests and our values. If you insist on continuing with this career that brings shame to our name and demonstrates such poor judgment, then you will need to make a choice. What kind of choice? I asked, though I already knew. The entire evening had been building to this moment, and I had prepared for it even though experiencing it still carried the sting of betrayal. My father stepped forward, his physical proximity another form of intimidation. The choice is simple, Sarah. You either quit your job and join the family business, accepting your proper role and responsibilities, or you leave this family. You cannot have it both ways. You cannot claim to be a Thornton while working to undermine everything this family has built. You cannot benefit from this family's name, connections, and support while pursuing a career that exists to persecute successful people like us. There it was. The ultimatum delivered in front of 23 witnesses who had been assembled specifically to ensure I understood the seriousness of the demand. Quit my job or be disowned. Abandon my career or lose my family. Submit to their control or be cast out entirely. They had crafted this moment carefully, choosing the venue, the audience, and the timing to maximize pressure and minimize my options for resistance. I looked around the table slowly, making eye contact with each person present. Most avoided my gaze, staring at their plates or their wine glasses or the spectacular view outside the windows. A few met my eyes with expressions of pity or discomfort. Only my grandmother held my gaze steadily, and in her eyes I saw not sympathy but assessment. She was waiting to see how I would respond, whether I would demonstrate strength or weakness in this moment of crisis. I set down my wine glass with deliberate care, the soft click of crystal on wood audible in the silent room. I smoothed my napkin across my lap, buying a few seconds to ensure my voice would be steady when I spoke. And then I looked directly at my father, then my mother, then each member of my immediate family who had participated in this attack. I need to understand something, I said quietly. Is this truly about my career choice? Or is this about something else entirely? Because the level of hostility toward my work seems disproportionate to a simple disagreement about professional paths. Don't try to change the subject, Victoria snapped. This is exactly like you, trying to make everything more complicated than it is. The question is simple. Are you going to quit that ridiculous job and join the real world? Or are you going to choose pride over family? I smiled then, a small expression that carried no warmth but considerable meaning. Actually, Victoria, I think the situation is considerably more complicated than you understand. But I appreciate the clarity of the ultimatum. It makes my decision much easier. My mother leaned forward, her voice sharp with warning. Sarah, do not make a choice you will regret. Think very carefully about what you are giving up. This family provides connections, support, and opportunities that you will never access on your own. Your father is offering you a position that people would kill for. You are throwing away your future out of stubbornness. I have thought very carefully, I said, standing now so that I could face them on more equal physical footing. I have spent the past 4 months thinking about almost nothing else, and I have reached several important conclusions. 4 months. My father's eyes narrowed dangerously. What happened 4 months ago? I reached into my purse and pulled out my phone, pulling up a specific folder of documents I had prepared for exactly this moment. 4 months ago, I was assigned to a case investigating a series of suspicious real estate transactions in the Seattle area. The case involved allegations of securities fraud, wire fraud, and conspiracy to defraud investors. As I investigated, I began to recognize some of the corporate entities involved. The shell companies, the offshore accounts, the carefully structured transactions designed to hide the actual ownership and flow of money. The blood drained from my father's face. My mother's hand flew to her throat. Around the table, confused family members looked between us, trying to understand what was happening. Only my grandmother remained still, her eyes fixed on me with an expression I could not read. You see, I continued, my voice steady despite the pounding of my heart. I did not choose to investigate Thornton Development. The case came to me through normal channels assigned because of my expertise in real estate securities fraud. But once I started looking at the evidence, once I started tracing the money and examining the transactions, I could not ignore what I was seeing. Even when I realized whose companies were involved, I could not unsee the patterns of fraud that were so clearly documented. You are lying. My father's voice shook with rage barely contained. You are making up these accusations because you are angry about this dinner, about our expectations for your life. This is exactly the kind of vindictive behavior that proves you are not suited for any position of real responsibility. I am not lying, Father, and I am not making accusations without evidence. I have spent 4 months building a case that documents systematic securities fraud, wire fraud, misrepresentation to investors, and conspiracy across multiple corporate entities controlled by Thornton Development and several associated shell companies. I have bank records, email communications, corporate filings, witness testimony, and forensic accounting analysis. And tomorrow morning, I will be presenting that case to a federal grand jury that will determine whether to indict. The room erupted in chaos. My Uncle Richard stood abruptly, demanding to know what I was talking about. My Aunt Caroline began to cry, though whether from shock or fear I could not tell. Victoria lunged toward me before my mother grabbed her arm, restraining her physically. Christopher sat frozen, his face cycling through expressions of disbelief, anger, and what might have been fear. And my father simply stared at me with an expression of such concentrated hatred that I actually took a step backward. "You are trying to destroy me." His words were barely above a whisper, but they carried across the chaos with perfect clarity. "Your own father. You are trying to put me in prison." "I am trying to ensure that investors who were defrauded receive justice," I corrected. "I am trying to hold accountable the people who systematically lied to them, stole from them, and violated the law for personal gain. The fact that you are my father does not change what you did. It does not excuse the fraud. And it does not exempt you from consequences." My mother found her voice, stepping forward with her hands raised in a placating gesture. "Sarah, please. You are clearly upset about this dinner. We pushed too hard, we should have approached this differently. But you cannot do this. Think about what this will do to the family. Think about your grandmother, your siblings, everyone in this room. You will destroy all of them along with your father. Then perhaps all of them should have spoken up when you delivered your ultimatum," I said, looking around at the shocked faces surrounding me. "Perhaps someone should have said that demanding I choose between my career and my family was wrong. Perhaps someone should have recognized that this dinner was not about loving concern but about control and intimidation. But nobody spoke. You all sat here and watched while they tried to destroy my life, and you said nothing." I picked up my purse and turned toward the door. Behind me, my father's voice rose to a roar. "If you walk out that door, you are dead to me. Dead to this entire family. You will have nothing. No inheritance, no support, no connection to the Thornton name. You will be alone." I paused at the threshold and looked back one final time. I have been alone in this family for my entire life. The only difference now is that I have stopped pretending otherwise. Enjoy your dinner. I suspect it may be the last time you are all together outside of a courtroom for quite some time. And then I walked out, leaving behind the shocked silence and the family that had never truly been mine. As I moved through the restaurant toward the exit, I pulled out my phone and typed a quick message to Rachel. "It is done. Meet me at the apartment. I need a drink and a friend in that order." The valet brought my Honda Civic around, and I tipped him generously before sliding behind the wheel. As I pulled away from the Riverside estate, I caught one last glimpse in my rearview mirror of the beautiful building where my family was probably still processing what had just occurred. Somewhere inside, my father was likely calling his attorney. My mother was probably trying to manage the family's reactions and control the narrative. And 23 people were learning that the quiet daughter, the disappointing child, the one who chose a government job over family approval, had just proven that she was far more dangerous than any of them had ever imagined. I drove toward my small apartment in Capitol Hill, toward my modest life that I had built with my own work and my own choices, and for the first time in as long as I could remember, I felt completely free. Tomorrow would bring challenges, confrontations, and consequences I could barely imagine. Tomorrow would begin the formal process of holding my father accountable for crimes that affected dozens of investors and violated the trust of everyone who had done business with Thornton Development. Tomorrow would transform me from Sarah Thornton, disappointing daughter, into Sarah Thornton, federal witness whose testimony would either make or break the case against her own family. But tonight I had reclaimed my own life. Tonight, I had chosen integrity over comfort, justice over family approval, and truth over the convenient lies that had sustained the Thornton family's reputation for decades. They had given me an ultimatum expecting submission. Instead, I had given them a reckoning they would never forget. The motivational truth at the heart of this moment was clear and undeniable. Sometimes the family we are born into demands that we sacrifice our principles, our integrity, and our very selves to maintain their comfort and control. Sometimes the price of belonging is the surrender of everything that makes us who we are. And sometimes the most courageous choice we can make is to walk away from that bargain, to choose the harder path of independence and authenticity, and to trust that the cost of freedom, however steep, is always worth paying. Because a life lived on someone else's terms, no matter how comfortable or secure, is not really a life at all. It is a slow death of the spirit, a gradual erosion of self until nothing remains but the hollow performance of someone else's expectations. I had chosen life. Whatever came next, I had chosen to live on my own terms. And that choice, that single moment of courage in the face of overwhelming pressure to submit, would define everything that followed. The drive from the Riverside estate to my Capitol Hill apartment normally took 25 minutes, but tonight I made it in 18. Not because I was driving recklessly, but because my mind was operating with the kind of hyper-focused clarity that comes after a major confrontation when adrenaline and purpose combine to sharpen every sense. The streets of Seattle passed in a blur of lights and movement, the city carrying on with its normal Friday evening rhythm, completely unaware that my entire world had just shifted on its axis. Somewhere behind me, my family was probably still sitting in that private dining room trying to process what had just happened. Somewhere in that gathering, my father was likely making urgent phone calls to his attorney. And somewhere in the elegant chaos of the Riverside estate, my mother was undoubtedly working to control the narrative and manage the family's response to my revelation. But I was moving forward, literally and figuratively, toward the life I had chosen and the consequences I had accepted. My hands were steady on the wheel despite the magnitude of what I had just done. My breathing was even and controlled despite the emotional turbulence beneath the surface. And my mind was already 3 steps ahead, planning the next moves in a strategy one had been developing for 4 months, but had only truly committed to in the moment I walked out of that dining room. My phone buzzed repeatedly in my purse as I drove, the notifications piling up with a persistence that suggested multiple people were trying to reach me simultaneously. I ignored them all. There would be time later to deal with the messages, the accusations, the attempts at manipulation or reconciliation or threat. Right now, I needed to get home, decompress with Rachel, and prepare mentally for what tomorrow would bring. The grand jury presentation was scheduled for 9 in the morning, which meant I had less than 15 hours to ensure I was in the right headspace to deliver the most important testimony of my career. I pulled into the parking lot of my building, just as the sun was setting behind the Olympic Mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that would have been beautiful if I had the emotional bandwidth to appreciate them. My apartment was in a modest 3-story complex that housed mostly young professionals and graduate students, the kind of building where everyone minded their own business and the rent was reasonable if not cheap. I had lived here for 3 years, ever since I moved back to Seattle after finishing my graduate degree and accepting the position with the SEC. It was not glamorous by any measure, but it was mine. Every piece of furniture had been purchased with my own money. Every bill was paid from my own salary. And every choice about how to live, what to prioritize, and who to be had been made according to my own values rather than someone else's expectations. Rachel's car was already in the lot when I arrived, her ancient Subaru occupying the visitor space she always used when coming over. She must have left her own place in Fremont the moment she received my text, racing across the city to be here when I arrived. The knowledge that she had dropped everything to support me created a warmth in my chest that contrasted sharply with the cold anger still simmering from the dinner confrontation. This was what real family looked like, I thought. Not the people who shared your DNA but who demanded you sacrifice yourself to maintain their comfort. Real family was the people who showed up when you needed them, who supported your choices even when they were difficult, and who loved you for who you actually were rather than who they wanted you to be. I found Rachel sitting on the stairs outside my apartment door, 2 bottles of wine in a bag beside her and an expression of fierce protective concern on her face. She stood when she saw me approaching, and I walked straight into the hug she offered without saying a word. We stood there in the hallway for a long moment, her arms around me providing the kind of unconditional support I had never received from my biological family. When we finally pulled apart, she searched my face with the intense scrutiny of someone who had known me since freshman year of college and could read my emotional state better than I could sometimes read it myself. "You actually did it," she said softly, a note of something like awe in her voice. "You told them." "I told them," I confirmed, unlocking my apartment door and ushering her inside. And it went exactly as badly as we expected it would go, which is to say it was a complete disaster that also somehow felt absolutely necessary and right. My apartment welcomed us with its familiar comfort. The living room was small but well organized, with a couch I had found on Craigslist and refurbished myself, a coffee table constructed from reclaimed wood, and bookshelves filled with legal texts, novels, and the kind of eclectic collection that reflected my actual interests rather than what looked impressive to visitors. The walls held artwork from local artists I had discovered at Pike Place Market, pieces that had spoken to me rather than pieces that carried prestigious names or investment value. The space was authentically mine in a way that my childhood bedroom in my parents' Laurelhurst mansion had never been. Rachel headed straight for the kitchen and began opening the wine while I kicked off my heels and collapsed onto the couch with a groan of relief. The physical exhaustion hit me all at once now that I was in a safe space, the adrenaline that had sustained me through the dinner finally ebbing and leaving behind a bone-deep weariness. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting my head fall back against the cushions, and tried to process the enormity of what had just occurred. "Start from the beginning," Rachel instructed as she returned with 2 generously filled wine glasses. She handed me one and settled into the armchair across from me, her entire posture conveying readiness to listen to every detail. "What happened from the moment you walked in?" I took a long sip of wine, a California Pinot Noir that Rachel knew was my favorite, and began to recount the evening. I described the elegant setting of the riverside estate, the carefully orchestrated seating arrangement, the way my family had been positioned as both audience and jury for the ultimatum my parents planned to deliver. I detailed the opening pleasantries that had felt increasingly surreal as I waited for the axe to fall, knowing what was coming but unable to stop the inevitable progression toward confrontation. I explained how my father had initiated the attack with his comment about purpose, and how the rest of my immediate family had piled on with their rehearsed criticisms and judgments. Rachel listened without interruption, her expression growing progressively more outraged as I described the escalating hostility and the coordinated nature of the assault. When I reached the moment of the actual ultimatum, her hand tightened on her wine glass hard enough that I worried briefly about the structural integrity of the crystal. "They actually said you had to choose between your career and your family," she repeated, her voice tight with controlled fury. "They gathered 23 people to witness them delivering that ultimatum. They orchestrated an entire performance designed to humiliate you into submission." "They did," I confirmed, "and they genuinely believed it would work. They thought that by making it public, by having the whole family witness my choice, they could pressure me into quitting the SEC and coming to work for Thornton Development where they could control me properly. But they had no idea you were already investigating them," Rachel said, leaning forward with the kind of intense focus she brought to her work as a civil rights attorney. "They delivered their ultimatum completely unaware that you had spent 4 months building a case against your own father." "They had no idea," I agreed, "and the looks on their faces when I told them was something I will remember for the rest of my life." My father went from smug certainty to absolute shock in the space of about 3 seconds. My mother looked like I had physically struck her, and the rest of the family just sat there trying to understand what was happening. Rachel was quiet for a moment, sipping her wine and processing everything I had told her. We had been friends for over a decade, having met during orientation week at Princeton, and bonding over our shared sense of being outsiders in an environment that seemed designed for people born into privilege. She had known my family, had witnessed their dynamics during visits home over the years, and had been one of the few people who understood why I had chosen to pursue a career in financial regulation, rather than following the path my parents had mapped out for me. "Tell me about the case," she said finally. "I know you could not share details while the investigation was active, but now that you have gone public with your family, I need to understand exactly what your father did." I set down my wine glass and pulled my laptop from my work bag, opening the files I had been compiling for months. The screen illuminated with spreadsheets, transaction records, email chains, and forensic accounting analyses that documented a pattern of securities fraud spanning nearly 5 years. I turned the laptop so Rachel could see the summary document I had prepared for the grand jury presentation, and I began to explain what I had discovered. "Thornton Development operates as a commercial real estate firm," I began, falling into the analytical mode that had served me well throughout my career at the SEC. "On the surface, it is a legitimate business that acquires properties, develops them, and either sells or leases them for profit. My father has been doing this for 25 years, and for most of that time, the business operated within legal boundaries. But about 5 years ago something changed. The market became more competitive, returns were harder to generate, and my father started looking for ways to maintain the growth trajectory that had defined the company's success. Rachel nodded, following along as I pulled up a timeline that showed the evolution of Thornton Development's business practices. What did he do? He created a network of shell companies, I explained, clicking through a diagram that illustrated the corporate structure. Limited liability companies registered in Delaware with opaque ownership structures that made it difficult to trace back to Thornton Development. These shell companies would purchase properties at market value, then immediately resell them to Thornton Development at inflated prices. On paper, it looked like Thornton Development was paying fair market value for properties. In reality, the shell companies were controlled by my father, which meant he was essentially selling properties to himself at inflated prices. Why would he do that? Rachel asked, leaning closer to study the diagram. What is the advantage of paying more for properties? The advantage comes in how the transactions were presented to investors, I said, pulling up another set of documents. Thornton Development raises capital through private investment offerings. Wealthy individuals invest money in specific development projects with the expectation of returns based on the project's success. But the financial information my father provided to these investors was based on the inflated purchase prices from the shell company transactions. He was misrepresenting the actual cost basis of the properties, which meant he was also misrepresenting the potential returns and risks. Rachel's eyes widened as she began to understand the implications. So investors thought they were getting into deals with certain profit margins based on the purchase prices your father reported, but the actual margins were much lower because the real purchase prices were significantly less. Exactly, I confirmed. And it gets worse. The shell companies that made these inflated purchases were not using their own capital. They were using loans from offshore banks that my father had relationships with, banks that understood the money would flow right back to them through the resale to Thornton Development. The loans were essentially fictional, creating the appearance of arm's-length transactions when in reality the whole thing was an orchestrated scheme to defraud investors. I pulled up email chains that showed my father coordinating these transactions with associates who managed the shell companies and representatives from the offshore banks. The communications were damning. Using language that made clear everyone involved understood, they were structuring transactions to deceive investors, rather than conducting legitimate business. There were references to keeping certain details from the auditors, discussions about how to present the information to potential investors, and explicit acknowledgments that the actual profit margins were lower than what was being represented. How much money are we talking about? Rachel asked quietly, her legal mind clearly already calculating the potential criminal exposure and civil liability. Across all the investments affected, approximately $47 million, I said, the number still shocking even though I had been working with it for months. That is capital raised from investors based on materially false and misleading information about the underlying assets and potential returns. Not all of that money is lost because the projects did generate some returns, but the returns were significantly lower than what investors were promised, and the risk was significantly higher than what they were told. Rachel sat back in her chair, processing the magnitude of the fraud. $47 million in fraudulent investment offerings. That is federal securities fraud on a massive scale. That is wire fraud for every communication used to facilitate the scheme. That is potentially RICO charges if you can establish the pattern of criminal activity across the enterprise. The U.S. Attorney's Office is considering all of those charges, I confirmed. The grand jury tomorrow is specifically for the securities fraud and wire fraud charges, which are the most straightforward to prove based on the evidence we have gathered. But they have made it clear that depending on what the investigation uncovers going forward, additional charges could be added. And you are the primary investigator on this case, Rachel said, not as a question but as a statement of fact that she was still processing. You built this case. You gathered this evidence. You are the person who is going to testify to the grand jury about why they should indict your own father. The weight of that reality settled over us both. I had known for months that this moment was coming, had prepared for it mentally and emotionally to the best of my ability, but actually being here on the eve of the grand jury presentation made it feel viscerally real in a way that all my preparation had not quite captured. I did not choose this case, I said. needing to articulate the distinction one more time even though Rachel already understood it. It came to me through normal channels. A whistleblower from one of the shell companies contacted the SEC with concerns about the transactions. The case was assigned to me because of my expertise in real estate securities fraud. I did not know it involved my father until I was already deep into the investigation. But once you knew, you could have recused yourself, Rachel pointed out gently. You could have turned the case over to another investigator and stepped away from the personal conflict. Nobody would have faulted you for that choice. I thought about it, I admitted. For about 24 hours after I made the connection between the shell companies and Thornton Development, I seriously considered requesting reassignment. But then I looked at the evidence I had already gathered, and I realized that I was probably the only person at the SEC who had the specific knowledge and access to understand the full scope of what my father was doing. I knew the company structure. I knew the key players. I knew the business practices. And I knew my father well enough to anticipate how he would try to defend or explain away the irregularities. So you made the choice to continue with the investigation even knowing it would destroy your relationship with your family, Rachel said, her voice soft with understanding. I made the choice to do my job, I corrected. I made the choice to pursue justice for the investors who were defrauded. The destruction of my relationship with my family was a consequence of that choice, but it was not the goal. And honestly, after tonight, after experiencing that dinner and that ultimatum, I am not sure how much of a relationship there actually was to destroy. They wanted a puppet they could control, not a daughter they could love for who she actually is. Rachel reached over and squeezed my hand, a gesture of support that needed no words. We sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, both of us sipping our wine and processing the events of the evening. Outside my window, the city lights of Seattle twinkled in the gathering darkness, thousands of people living their lives completely unaware that tomorrow morning a grand jury would hear evidence that could bring down one of the city's most prominent business families. What happens tomorrow? Rachel asked eventually. Walk me through the process. I appreciated her practical focus, the way she helped me shift from emotional processing to tactical preparation. The grand jury convenes at 9 in the morning. I will present the evidence we have gathered over the past 4 months, explaining the scheme, showing the documentation, and walking them through the specific transactions that constitute securities fraud and wire fraud. The assistant U.S. attorney handling the case will guide me through the presentation, asking questions designed to help me lay out the facts clearly and comprehensively. How long will it take? Rachel asked. Probably 3 to 4 hours, I estimated. We have a lot of evidence to cover, and the AUSA wants to make sure the grand jury understands not just what happened but why it matters. After I finish testifying, they may call other witnesses including some of the investors who were defrauded and possibly the whistleblower who initially contacted us. Then the grand jury will deliberate and vote on whether there is probable cause to indict. When will you know the result? Probably by end of day tomorrow, I said. The AUSA will contact me once the grand jury reaches a decision. If they vote to indict, which we expect they will given the strength of the evidence, then the indictment will be unsealed and my father will be arrested. The reality of those words hung in the air between us. My father would be arrested. He would be taken into federal custody, fingerprinted, photographed and processed through the criminal justice system like any other defendant. The man who had built a commercial real estate empire, who sat on nonprofit boards and hosted charity galas, who was respected and admired in Seattle's business community, would be reduced to a defendant facing decades in federal prison. How are you feeling about all of this? Rachel asked, her tone shifting from analytical to personal. I know you are prepared professionally, but emotionally, how are you processing the fact that your testimony tomorrow will likely result in your father's arrest? I took a long sip of wine, considering how to articulate the complex tangle of emotions I had been navigating for months. I feel angry, I said finally. Angry that he did this, angry that he put his own greed above the well-being of people who trusted him, angry that he created a situation where his own daughter would have to be the one to hold him accountable. I feel sad too, sad about the family relationships that are being destroyed, sad about the fact that my father chose this path when he could have built success legitimately. I paused, searching for words to capture the rest of it. But I also feel certain that what I am doing is right. certain that investors deserve justice, certain that people who commit fraud need to face consequences regardless of who they are or what family they come from. And I feel relieved, honestly relieved that the secret I have been carrying for 4 months is finally going to be public, relieved that I do not have to pretend anymore with my family, relieved that I can stop living in the space between who I actually am and who they wanted me to be. Rachel nodded slowly, absorbing my words. You know they are going to fight this, right? Your father has resources, connections, and expensive lawyers. He is going to mount an aggressive defense, and part of that defense will probably involve trying to discredit you. I know, I said quietly. I am prepared for that. The evidence stands on its own regardless of what he says about my motives or credibility. But yes, I expect him to claim that I fabricated evidence out of anger about family dynamics, that I am mentally unstable, that I have always been jealous of his success. He will try to make this about me rather than about what he did. And your mother and siblings will back him up, Rachel added. They will close ranks around him, support his narrative, and probably participate in trying to destroy your reputation. They already started that process tonight, I pointed out. The way they coordinated their attacks at dinner, the narrative they had constructed about me being a burden on the family, the unanimous pressure to force me to quit my job. That was all preparation for what comes next. They were trying to establish control before the case became public, trying to neutralize me as a threat by forcing me to choose between my career and my family. But their strategy backfired spectacularly, Rachel observed with a small smile. Because instead of intimidating you into submission, they gave you the perfect opening to reveal that you were already investigating them. They walked right into your counteroffensive without even realizing the battle had already begun. I returned her smile, appreciating the tactical analysis. They underestimated me. They always have. They saw me as the quiet daughter, the one who did not quite measure up to their expectations, the one who could be controlled through approval or disapproval. They never considered that I might have my own power, my own capabilities, my own willingness to stand up to them when it mattered. We talked for another hour, working through logistics and contingencies. Rachel helped me think through potential scenarios for the next few days, from the grand jury presentation to the likely indictment to the media attention that would follow. We discussed how to handle contact attempts from my family, how to manage the professional pressures I would face, and how to maintain my emotional equilibrium through what would undoubtedly be one of the most challenging periods of my life. By the time Rachel left around midnight, I felt more grounded and prepared than I had when I first walked through my apartment door. I changed into comfortable clothes, made a cup of chamomile tea, and settled onto my couch with my grand jury presentation materials spread across the coffee table. I reviewed the evidence one more time, not because I needed additional preparation but because the familiar work of analysis and organization helped quiet my mind. My phone had accumulated 43 text messages, 12 voicemails, and several missed calls from numbers I did not recognize. I scrolled through the messages briefly, noting that most were from family members demanding explanations, offering threats, or attempting various forms of manipulation. My mother had sent 6 messages that progressed from hurt confusion to maternal guilt-tripping to barely concealed rage. My sister Victoria had contributed a series of increasingly hysterical accusations. My brother Christopher had sent one message calling me a traitor and suggesting I should be ashamed of myself. Various aunts, uncles, and cousins had weighed in with their perspectives, almost universally condemning my choices and defending my father. Only 2 messages stood out from the flood of hostility. My grandmother had sent a single text that read simply, "I always knew you were stronger than they gave you credit for. Be careful." And my Uncle Richard, my father's younger brother, had written, "I do not know what is happening, but I know you would not do something like this without serious reasons. If you need anything, call me." I saved both of those messages and deleted everything else without responding. There would be time later to sort through family relationships and determine which connections might be salvageable and which were permanently broken. Tonight, I needed to focus on tomorrow's testimony and the beginning of the formal accountability process that would unfold over the coming months. I took a long shower, letting the hot water ease the tension from my shoulders and wash away the emotional residue of the dinner confrontation. As I stood under the stream, I thought about the moment I had walked out of the Riverside estate, leaving behind the family that had never truly accepted me for who I was. That walk, those steps from the dining room through the restaurant to my car, had been the physical manifestation of a choice I had actually made 4 months earlier when I decided to continue investigating my father rather than recusing myself from the case. Everything that followed from that initial choice had been inevitable, a chain of consequences that led inexorably to tonight's ultimatum and my revelation of the investigation. My parents had thought they were forcing a choice, but the choice had already been made long before they orchestrated their dramatic confrontation. I had chosen integrity over family loyalty, justice over comfort, and truth over the convenient fictions that sustained my family's reputation. Walking out of that dinner had simply been the public acknowledgement of a decision I had already committed to in private. I dried off, put on my favorite pajamas, and climbed into bed with a book I had been reading about the history of securities regulation in America. The irony of the choice was not lost on me given the circumstances, but the familiar academic prose helped settle my mind and create some distance from the emotional intensity of the day. I read for about 30 minutes before my eyes grew heavy and the words began to blur on the page. As I turned off the light and settled into the darkness of my bedroom, I thought about what tomorrow would bring. The grand jury testimony, the likely indictment, the arrest of my father, the media attention, the professional and personal challenges, the ongoing investigation and eventual trial, the complete transformation of my life, and my relationship with my family. It was overwhelming when I considered it all at once, an enormous cascade of consequences that stemmed from one choice to pursue the truth regardless of personal cost. But I also thought about the investors who had lost money because they trusted my father and believed the information he provided about his business. I thought about the elderly couple who had invested their retirement savings in a Thornton development project based on financial projections that were materially false. I thought about the small business owner who had put her life savings into what she believed was a secure commercial real estate investment, only to discover the returns were a fraction of what had been promised. I thought about all the people who had been harmed by my father's fraud, people who deserved justice and accountability even if obtaining it required me to testify against my own family. That was why I had made this choice. Not out of anger or revenge or family drama, but out of a fundamental commitment to the principle that justice matters more than comfort, that truth matters more than loyalty, and that protecting the vulnerable matters more than protecting the powerful. Tomorrow I would stand before a grand jury and present evidence that would likely destroy my father's freedom, reputation, and legacy. But I would do so knowing that I had chosen the right path, the harder path, the path that aligned with my deepest values rather than my family's expectations. The motivational truth at the heart of this moment was one I had learned gradually over 4 months of investigation and emotional preparation. Sometimes doing what is right requires us to stand against the people we are supposed to love unconditionally. Sometimes justice demands that we hold accountable the very people who raised us, supported us, and gave us opportunities. And sometimes the most courageous choice we can make is to refuse the false binary between family loyalty and moral integrity, to reject the idea that we must choose between standing up for what is right and maintaining family relationships. Because real family, real love, real connection should never require us to compromise our fundamental values or participate in injustice. Real family should celebrate when we demonstrate integrity, even when it is difficult. Real family should support our commitment to doing what is right, even when it creates personal costs. And when our biological family cannot or will not provide that kind of unconditional support for our moral choices, then we must have the courage to build our own family from people who share our values and stand beside us in the fight for justice. I had walked away from the Thornton family tonight, but I had walked towards something better. A life of integrity, a career of meaning, a community of people who valued me for who I actually was rather than who they wanted me to be. Tomorrow would be hard. The weeks and months ahead would be harder still. But I would face them with the certainty that comes from knowing you have made the right choice, even when that choice costs you everything you thought you were supposed to want. Sleep came eventually, bringing with it dreams I would not remember in the morning. And when my alarm went off at 6, I would wake to face the most important day of my professional life, armed with evidence, conviction, and the quiet strength that comes from finally choosing yourself over the expectations of people who never truly saw you for who you were. The morning arrived with the kind of crystalline clarity that Seattle rarely offered in late autumn, the sky a brilliant blue unmarred by the clouds that typically shrouded the city during this season. I woke at 6 without needing my alarm, my body's internal systems already operating on high alert despite the few hours of sleep I had managed. The sunlight streaming through my bedroom window felt almost accusatory in its brightness, as though the universe itself had decided that today would be conducted under the harsh illumination of absolute transparency rather than the comfortable shadows I might have preferred. I went through my morning routine with mechanical precision, each action deliberate and focused. Shower at precisely the temperature I needed to feel alert without being jarring. Coffee brewed strong enough to provide caffeine without creating jitters that might undermine my composure during testimony. Breakfast consisting of protein and complex carbohydrates that would sustain energy without causing digestive distress during what would be several hours of intense focus. I dressed in my most professional suit, a charcoal gray ensemble that conveyed seriousness and credibility without appearing aggressive or theatrical. The outfit was one I had worn to important depositions and court appearances throughout my career at the SEC, familiar armor that helped me step into the role of federal investigator rather than conflicted daughter. As I stood before my bathroom mirror applying minimal makeup and ensuring my appearance met the exacting standards I maintained for professional settings, I caught my own eyes in the reflection and held that gaze for a long moment. The woman looking back at me appeared calm, composed, and ready for the challenge ahead. But beneath that carefully constructed exterior, I could feel the nervous energy thrumming through my system, the awareness that today would fundamentally alter the trajectory of multiple lives including my own. I thought about my father, probably waking in his Laurelhurst mansion completely unaware that by the end of this day, he would likely be facing federal indictment. I thought about my mother, who had spent so many years enabling and benefiting from the fraud I was about to expose. And I thought about the investors who had trusted my father and lost money because of that misplaced trust, people who deserved accountability even if obtaining it required me to testify against my own family. The drive to the federal courthouse took 35 minutes through morning traffic, giving me time to mentally review the presentation I would deliver to the grand jury. I had prepared exhaustively for this testimony, rehearsing my explanations of complex financial transactions until I could articulate them clearly and concisely. I had organized the evidence into a logical narrative that would guide the grand jurors through the scheme step by step, building from basic facts to more sophisticated analysis. And I had anticipated likely questions, preparing responses that would be truthful and complete without veering into speculation or commentary beyond my expertise. The federal courthouse occupied an imposing modernist building in downtown Seattle, all glass and steel and angular lines that suggested the weight and authority of the justice system. I had been here dozens of times over the course of my career with the SEC, testifying in various cases and meeting with prosecutors about ongoing investigations. But today felt different, charged with a significance that went beyond the normal professional responsibilities of my position. Today I would cross a line that could never be uncrossed, transforming from investigator of abstract financial crimes into the person whose testimony would likely result in her own father's arrest. I parked in the underground garage and took the elevator to the 4th floor where the grand jury convened. The hallway outside the grand jury room was quiet at this early hour, just a few attorneys and witnesses waiting for proceedings to begin. I found Assistant U.S. Attorney Michael Chun sitting on one of the benches reviewing documents, his expression focused and serious in the way I had come to recognize over the 4 months we had worked together building this case. He looked up as I approached and offered a small smile of greeting that contained both professional confidence and personal understanding of what this testimony meant for me. "Sarah, good morning. How are you feeling?" His question was genuine rather than perfunctory, an acknowledgement that this was not a routine testimony despite my extensive experience as an expert witness. "Ready," I said, sitting beside him and setting my briefcase on the floor. "Nervous but ready. I have been preparing for this moment for 4 months. I know the evidence. I know the case. I can do this." Michael nodded approvingly. "You can absolutely do this. Remember that you are not on trial here. The grand jurors are not evaluating you. They are evaluating the evidence you have gathered and determining whether it establishes probable cause to believe that crimes were committed. Your job is simply to present that evidence clearly and honestly. Let the facts speak for themselves." We spent the next 20 minutes doing a final review of the presentation structure and key exhibits. Michael walked me through the questions he would ask to guide my testimony, ensuring I understood the narrative arc we were constructing for the grand jury. He reminded me to speak in plain language rather than relying on technical jargon that might confuse jurors without financial backgrounds. He emphasized the importance of maintaining professional composure, even when discussing aspects of the case that involved my family members. And he reassured me that he would intervene if any questions from the grand jurors seemed inappropriate or outside the scope of what I should be expected to address. At 8:45, a clerk emerged from the grand jury room and indicated they were ready to begin. I gathered my materials, took a deep breath to center myself, and followed Michael through the door into a space I had entered many times before, but which today felt entirely different. The grand jury room was configured like a small classroom, with tiered seating for the 23 citizens who served on the panel and a witness stand positioned at the front. The jurors were already seated, a diverse group representing various ages, backgrounds, and demographics from the Seattle area. They looked at me with expressions of curiosity and attention as I took my seat at the witness stand and placed my right hand on the Bible to be sworn in. The clerk administered the oath, and I affirmed that I would tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. The familiar words carried additional weight today given that the truth I would be telling involved such deeply personal betrayals and family destruction. But I had made my choice months ago, and I would honor that choice by providing complete and honest testimony, regardless of the consequences for my relationships or emotional well-being. Michael began with establishing questions that introduced me to the grand jury and outlined my qualifications. I explained my educational background, my graduate degree in financial forensics from Georgetown, and my 6 years of experience with the SEC investigating securities fraud and market manipulation. I described the types of cases I typically worked on and the methodologies I employed to uncover and document financial crimes. The grand jurors listened attentively, some taking notes, others simply focusing their full attention on my testimony. Then Michael shifted to the specific case that had brought us here today. He asked me to explain how the investigation began, and I recounted receiving the case assignment 4 months earlier after a whistleblower contacted the SEC with concerns about suspicious real estate transactions. I described the initial evidence I reviewed, the patterns I began to notice in the corporate structures and financial flows, and the moment I realized that the companies under investigation were connected to Thornton Development, my father's firm. "What did you do when you made that connection?" Michael asked, his tone neutral but his eyes conveying understanding of how difficult that moment must have been. "I informed my supervisor immediately," I explained, looking directly at the grand jurors as I spoke. "I disclosed the family relationship and the potential conflict of interest. My supervisor and I discussed whether I should recuse myself from the investigation and transfer the case to another investigator. We ultimately decided that I should continue with the investigation because of my specific expertise in real estate securities fraud and my familiarity with the company structure, but with additional oversight and regular check-ins to ensure the investigation remained objective and professional." One of the grand jurors, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a thoughtful expression, raised her hand. Michael acknowledged her and she asked, "Was it difficult to investigate your own father's company? How did you maintain objectivity given the personal relationship?" I appreciated the directness of the question and the genuine curiosity behind it. "It was extremely difficult," I admitted, "but I relied on the same principles that guide all my investigative work. I focused on the evidence rather than my feelings about the people involved. I documented facts rather than making assumptions based on personal knowledge. And I consulted regularly with colleagues and supervisors to ensure my analysis remained rigorous and unbiased. The evidence either supported allegations of fraud or it did not. My relationship to the person who committed that fraud did not change the facts." The juror nodded, seemingly satisfied with my response. Michael continued guiding me through the testimony, and I began to explain the fraudulent scheme in detail. I used visual aids to illustrate the corporate structure, showing how the shell companies connected to Thornton Development through complex ownership arrangements designed to obscure the relationships. I walked through specific transactions, using bank records and wire transfer documentation to show how properties were purchased by the shell companies and immediately resold to Thornton Development at inflated prices. "Why would someone structure transactions this way?" Michael asked, though we both knew he understood the answer perfectly well. The question was for the benefit of the grand jurors, helping them understand the purpose behind the complex arrangements. The inflated purchase prices served multiple functions in the fraudulent scheme, I explained, pulling up a slide that outlined the various benefits my father derived from these arrangements. First, when Thornton Development raised capital from investors for specific development projects, the financial projections were based on these inflated purchase prices. Investors believed they were investing in projects with certain profit margins based on what they were told the properties cost. But because the actual acquisition costs were significantly lower, the real profit margins were much smaller than represented. I continued, warming to the explanation as I moved through material I had analyzed countless times over the past months. Second, the inflated purchase prices allowed my father to extract money from the investment partnerships before the projects even began generating revenue. The shell companies would receive payment for the inflated property values, and that money would flow through offshore bank accounts before eventually making its way back to accounts controlled by my father. Investors thought their capital was going toward property acquisition when in reality a significant portion was being siphoned off through this circular transaction structure. Another grand juror, a younger man who appeared to be in his 30s, asked for clarification about the offshore bank accounts. I explained how the banks operated, their role in facilitating the scheme by providing loans to the shell companies that were immediately repaid through the Thornton Development purchases, and how the fee structures and account arrangements suggested the banks understood and participated in the fraudulent nature of the transactions. For the next 2 hours, I methodically presented the evidence we had gathered. I showed email communications between my father and the individuals who managed the shell companies, messages that made clear everyone involved understood they were structuring transactions to deceive investors rather than conducting legitimate business. I presented testimony from the whistleblower who had initially contacted the SEC, a former employee of one of the shell companies who became concerned about the legality of the arrangements and the potential harm to investors. I walked through financial analyses conducted by forensic accountants who had examined Thornton Development's books and confirmed that the company's actual costs and profit margins differed substantially from what had been represented to investors. The grand jurors asked thoughtful questions throughout my testimony, seeking clarification on technical points and probing to understand the relationships between different elements of the scheme. I appreciated their engagement and the seriousness with which they approached their responsibility. These were ordinary citizens who had been asked to evaluate complex financial evidence and determine whether probable cause existed to indict someone for federal crimes. They deserved clear, honest, complete testimony that would enable them to make an informed decision. As we approached the 3-hour mark, Michael began to wrap up his questioning by asking me to summarize the total impact of the fraudulent scheme. I pulled up a final slide that showed the aggregate numbers across all affected investment partnerships. $47 million raised from investors based on materially false and misleading information about property acquisition costs, projected returns, and investment risks. Approximately 68 investors who had committed capital to various Thornton Development projects over a 5-year period, most of whom had received returns significantly lower than what had been projected in the offering materials. And a pattern of conduct that demonstrated systematic fraud, rather than isolated mistakes or misunderstandings. Based on your investigation and analysis of the evidence, Michael asked in his final question, do you have an opinion about whether Gerald Thornton knowingly and intentionally defrauded investors through the scheme you have described? I looked at Michael, then at the grand jurors, and finally allowed myself to think about my father as I formulated my response. I thought about the man who had raised me, who had paid for my education, who had given me opportunities and advantages that shaped who I became. But I also thought about the evidence I had reviewed over 4 months of investigation, the clear documentation of deliberate deception, and the investors who had lost money because they trusted him. Yes, I said clearly and firmly. Based on the email communications, the structure of the transactions, the representations made to investors, and the financial analysis of actual costs versus reported costs, I believe the evidence demonstrates that Gerald Thornton knowingly and intentionally structured these transactions to defraud investors. This was not a matter of negligence or misunderstanding. The evidence shows deliberate planning, coordination with multiple parties, and systematic execution of a scheme designed to misrepresent material facts to investors for personal gain. The room was silent for a moment after I finished speaking. Then Michael thanked me for my testimony and asked if the grand jurors had any final questions. A few hands went up, and I spent another 30 minutes addressing various points of clarification and additional inquiries. The questions were respectful and focused, suggesting the jurors had followed my testimony carefully and were taking their responsibility seriously. Finally, the foreman of the grand jury indicated they had no further questions for me. Michael thanked me again for my testimony and excused me from the witness stand. I gathered my materials and walked out of the grand jury room on legs that felt slightly unsteady after sitting for over 3 hours. The clerk directed me to a small conference room where I could wait while the grand jury heard from additional witnesses and deliberated on whether to return an indictment. I sat in the quiet conference room alone with my thoughts and my phone, which had accumulated another 27 messages during the hours I had been testifying. I scrolled through them briefly, noting more of the same patterns from the night before. Angry messages from family members, threats from people claiming to be friends of my father, and a few supportive notes from colleagues who had somehow learned about the case. I set the phone aside and instead pulled out my laptop to review other work, trying to focus on routine matters that had nothing to do with my family or this case. Michael checked on me around 1 in the afternoon to let me know the grand jury had broken for lunch and would resume deliberations afterward. He seemed pleased with how the testimony had gone, expressing confidence that the evidence was strong and the presentation had been clear and compelling. We discussed next steps if the grand jury returned an indictment as expected, including the timing of my father's arrest and the likely media attention that would follow. Michael warned me to be prepared for reporters seeking comments and advised me to refer all media inquiries to the U.S. Attorney's Office press liaison rather than speaking directly to journalists. The afternoon stretched interminably as I waited for word from the grand jury. I tried to read case files and draft reports for other investigations, but my concentration was fragmented and I found myself reading the same paragraphs multiple times without retaining information. Instead, I allowed my mind to wander through memories of my father, trying to reconcile the person I had known growing up with the person whose crimes I had just finished documenting for a federal grand jury. I remembered my father teaching me to ride a bike when I was 6 years old, running beside me with his hand on the seat until I found my balance and pedaled away on my own. I remembered him attending my high school graduation and telling me he was proud of my academic achievements. I remembered the day he drove me to Princeton for my freshman year of college, helping me move into my dormitory, and giving me advice about making the most of my opportunities. Those memories were real. The person who did those things had genuinely cared about me in his own way, had wanted good things for my life even if his vision of what constituted good did not align with my own values and choices. But I also remembered the countless times he had dismissed my opinions as naive or uninformed. I remembered the way he spoke about people who were less successful with thinly veiled contempt, suggesting that wealth was a measure of worth and poverty a sign of failure. I remembered his impatience with any perspective that suggested business should be constrained by ethical considerations beyond profit maximization. And I remembered the casual way he had spoken about regulatory agencies and enforcement actions, as though the rules that governed everyone else should not apply to him because he was smarter and more sophisticated than the bureaucrats who wrote them. The person who committed the fraud I had investigated was the same person who had taught me to ride a bike. Both versions were real. Both versions had shaped who I became. And the fact that I loved the father who had given me opportunities and advantages did not change my responsibility to hold accountable the man who had systematically defrauded investors for personal gain. Justice did not allow for such convenient compartmentalization. Either the evidence demonstrated criminal conduct or it did not. Either investors deserved accountability or they did not. My complicated feelings about my father were irrelevant to those fundamental questions. At 4:17 in the afternoon, Michael appeared in the doorway of the conference room with an expression that told me everything I needed to know before he spoke a single word. "The grand jury returned a true bill," he said quietly, using the formal legal language for an indictment. 8 counts of securities fraud, 12 counts of wire fraud, and 3 counts of conspiracy to commit fraud. The indictment will be unsealed tomorrow morning, and we will coordinate with the FBI to execute the arrest warrant. I nodded slowly, absorbing the information that I had known intellectually was coming, but which still carried emotional weight when delivered as accomplished fact. My father would be arrested tomorrow morning. He would be taken into federal custody, processed through the criminal justice system, and required to answer for the crimes documented in the indictment. The investigation I had conducted, the evidence I had gathered, and the testimony I had delivered today had led directly to this outcome. "Are you all right?" Michael asked, studying my face with concern. "I am fine," I said, though I was not entirely certain that was true. This is what needed to happen. The evidence supported the charges. The grand jury made the right decision based on the facts presented to them. "I am fine." Michael did not look entirely convinced, but he respected my assertion and moved on to discussing logistics. He explained that the U.S. Attorney's Office would issue a press release tomorrow morning announcing the indictment and providing basic information about the charges. He confirmed that I should not speak to media or respond to any inquiries about the case. And he warned me that my father's attorneys would likely mount an aggressive defense that could include attempts to discredit me personally or suggest that my testimony was motivated by family animus rather than professional obligation. "Let them try," I said with more confidence than I felt. "The evidence speaks for itself. My relationship to the defendant does not change the facts of what he did or the harm caused to investors." I left the federal courthouse around 5 in the evening, emerging into a city that had continued its normal operations completely unaware of the momentous events unfolding within the justice system. The rush hour traffic was building as workers headed home from downtown offices, and the streets were filled with people going about their ordinary lives. I felt oddly disconnected from the normalcy surrounding me, as though I existed in a parallel reality where everything had just fundamentally changed, while the rest of the world remained oblivious. My phone rang as I walked to my car, and I saw my grandmother's name on the screen. I hesitated for a moment before answering, uncertain what to expect from this conversation. "Hello, Grandma." "Sarah, sweetheart. I heard about what happened at the family dinner last night. Your mother called me this morning quite upset." Her voice was calm and measured, giving nothing away about her own perspective on the situation. "I imagine she was," I said carefully, unsure how much my grandmother knew or what narrative my parents had constructed about the evening's events. "She told me you made some very serious accusations against your father," my grandmother continued. "She said you claimed to be investigating him for financial crimes, and that you planned to testify to a grand jury. She thought you were having some kind of breakdown, that the stress of your job had caused you to fabricate these allegations." I leaned against my car, suddenly exhausted by the thought of having to defend myself and explain my choices yet again. "I am not having a breakdown, Grandma. Everything I told them last night was true. I have been investigating Thornton Development for 4 months as part of my work with the SEC. The evidence documents systematic securities fraud over a 5-year period. And I testified to a federal grand jury this morning about that evidence." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. When my grandmother spoke again, her voice was very quiet. "And what did the grand jury decide?" "They returned an indictment. My father will be arrested tomorrow morning on multiple counts of securities fraud, wire fraud, and conspiracy." Another silence, longer this time. I could hear my grandmother breathing on the other end of the line, processing information that must have been devastating despite whatever suspicions she might have harbored about my father's business practices. "I see," she said finally. "Sarah, I need you to understand something. Your father is my son. I love him despite his flaws and failures. I will support him through whatever comes next because that is what mothers do for their children. But I also need you to know that I am proud of you for having the courage to do what was right even when it cost you everything." Tears sprang to my eyes unexpectedly, the first I had allowed myself to shed since walking out of the family dinner the previous night. "Thank you, Grandma. That means more to me than you know. Your grandfather would have been proud of you too," she continued, referring to my father's father who had died when I was in high school. "He always said that integrity was the most important thing a person could possess. He would have hated what your father did, and he would have understood why you had to expose it." We talked for a few more minutes before saying goodbye, and I sat in my car afterward allowing the tears to fall freely now that I was alone and safe from observation. The emotional release felt necessary and cleansing, a recognition of the genuine losses involved in my choices, even as I remained convinced those choices were correct. I was losing my family, Or at least the version of family I had grown up with. My relationships with my parents and siblings were probably beyond repair. My place in the extended family network would be contested and uncomfortable at best. But I had gained something too, something harder to quantify but no less valuable. I had gained the ability to look at myself in the mirror and know that I had chosen integrity over comfort, justice over family loyalty, and truth over the convenient lies that sustained my family's reputation. The motivational truth at the heart of this day was one that I would carry forward through everything that came next. Doing what is right often requires us to stand alone, to face opposition from the very people we are supposed to be able to count on for support, and to endure isolation in service of principles that matter more than acceptance. The grand jury testimony had been the culmination of months of preparation, and the beginning of a process that would unfold over many more months to come. But the hardest part had not been the testimony itself. The hardest part had been making the initial choice to continue the investigation when I realized it involved my father, and then reaffirming that choice every single day for 4 months as I gathered evidence that would ultimately lead to his arrest. Courage is not a single moment of dramatic action. Courage is the daily choice to continue moving forward on the path you know is right even when that path is lonely, difficult, and costly. Courage is maintaining your commitment to your values when everyone around you is pressuring you to compromise them. Courage is standing up for people who cannot stand up for themselves, even when doing so means standing against people who share your last name. I had demonstrated that courage today by telling the truth to a grand jury, regardless of the consequences for my family relationships. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as the indictment became public and my father faced arrest. But I would meet those challenges with the same commitment to truth and justice that had sustained me through the investigation and testimony. Because some things matter more than family approval or social acceptance or maintaining comfortable relationships. Justice matters. Truth matters. Protecting the vulnerable from the predatory matters. And those principles were worth fighting for even when the fight required me to stand against my own father. The notification came at 7:43 on Saturday morning, earlier than I had anticipated but not entirely unexpected given the efficiency with which federal law enforcement typically operated once an indictment had been unsealed. My phone buzzed with a text message from Michael Chun containing only 4 words that carried the weight of finality. Arrest completed. No incidents. I was sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold while I stared out the window at the Seattle skyline. My mind caught in the strange liminal space between the life I had known and the life that was beginning now that my father faced federal criminal charges. I had barely slept the previous night despite my exhaustion from the emotional and mental demands of the grand jury testimony. Every time I closed my eyes, my mind replayed moments from the investigation, fragments of evidence that documented my father's systematic fraud, and imagined scenarios of what would happen when the indictment became public knowledge. I had eventually given up on sleep around 5 in the morning, and instead made coffee and settled into the quiet darkness of my apartment to wait for sunrise and whatever the day would bring. Now, with the confirmation that my father had been taken into federal custody, I felt a strange combination of relief and something heavier that I could not quite name. Relief that the investigation had reached this critical milestone, that the months of gathering evidence and building the case had resulted in formal charges and accountability. But also a profound sadness at the reality that my father was at this moment being processed through the criminal justice system, fingerprinted and photographed, and reduced to a defendant number in a federal case. The man who had built a commercial real estate empire and commanded respect in Seattle's business community was now in the custody of FBI agents, his freedom constrained and his future uncertain. I refreshed the news websites on my laptop, knowing that the U.S. Attorney's Office would be releasing information about the arrest and indictment shortly. The major Seattle media outlets had not yet posted anything, suggesting the arrest had been conducted quietly enough to avoid immediate press attention. That would change soon. High-profile arrests of prominent business figures always generated significant media coverage, and my father's position in the Seattle community combined with the magnitude of the fraud allegations would make this a major story. At 8:15, the first news alert appeared on my phone. The Seattle Times had posted a breaking news story with the headline, "Prominent Seattle developer Gerald Thornton arrested on federal fraud charges." I clicked through to read the article, my heart rate accelerating as I saw my family's private crisis transformed into public news. The story was brief at this early stage, containing only the basic facts that the U.S. Attorney's Office had provided in their press release. Gerald Thornton, founder and CEO of Thornton Development, had been arrested on charges of securities fraud, wire fraud, and conspiracy related to real estate investment partnerships operated between 2018 and 2023. The indictment alleged that Thornton had systematically defrauded investors by misrepresenting the acquisition costs of properties and the projected returns on investments, resulting in losses to investors totaling millions of dollars. The article included a brief biography of my father, highlighting his 25 years in commercial real estate development, his service on various nonprofit boards, and his reputation as a successful and respected business leader. There was a quote from the U.S. attorney describing the charges as reflecting serious violations of securities laws designed to protect investors from fraudulent schemes. And there was a statement from my father's attorney, someone named Richard Castellano, whom I recognized as one of Seattle's most prominent white-collar criminal defense lawyers, asserting that the charges were baseless and that my father looked forward to clearing his name in court. Nowhere in the article was there any mention of me or my role in the investigation. The U.S. Attorney's Office had been careful to protect my identity as the primary investigator, understanding that my family relationship to the defendant created complications and potential safety concerns. But I knew that anonymity would not last long. My family knew I had investigated the case and testified to the grand jury. They would share that information with my father's defense team, who would likely use it to construct a narrative about the investigation being tainted by family conflict and personal animus. And eventually, through court filings or media leaks or simple gossip within Seattle's interconnected business and social circles, my involvement would become public knowledge. My phone began ringing almost immediately after the news broke, calls from numbers I did not recognize that I assumed were reporters seeking comments or additional information. I let them all go to voicemail, following Michael's advice to avoid any direct communication with media. I also received text messages from colleagues at the SEC expressing support and congratulating me on what they assumed was a successful conclusion to a major investigation. A few friends who had seen the news reached out to check on me, knowing my last name and making the connection even though the articles had not explicitly identified my role in the case. Rachel called at 8:30, her voice tight with concern. "I just saw the news. Are you okay? Do you need me to come over?" "I am managing," I said, though I was not entirely certain that was true. The arrest happened early this morning. No incidents according to my contact at the U.S. Attorney's Office. It is real now. It is public. There is no going back. There was no going back the moment you walked out of that family dinner, Rachel reminded me gently. This is just the formal acknowledgement of choices you made months ago. You knew this was coming. You prepared for it. Now you just have to get through the next phase. We talked for another 20 minutes, Rachel providing the grounding perspective I needed to maintain emotional equilibrium. She reminded me that I had done nothing wrong, that my investigation had been professional and thorough, and that my father's arrest was the direct consequence of his own criminal conduct rather than my vindictiveness or family dysfunction. She also warned me to be prepared for aggressive counterattacks from my father's legal team and family members who would try to shift blame and create alternative narratives about my motives and credibility. After we hung up, I forced myself to eat breakfast even though I had no appetite. I needed to maintain physical health and mental clarity through what would be an extended period of stress and challenge. I also needed to continue my normal routines as much as possible to avoid allowing this case to completely consume my life and identity. I was more than just the SEC investigator who had built a case against her own father. I had other work responsibilities, other relationships, other aspects of my life that deserved attention and energy. At 10 o'clock, I received a call from my supervisor at the SEC, a woman named Dr. Jennifer Walsh who had supported me throughout the investigation and had provided the oversight necessary to ensure the case remained professionally rigorous despite my personal connection to the defendant. She wanted to check on my well-being and discuss next steps now that the arrest had occurred. "Sarah, I know today must be incredibly difficult for you regardless of how prepared you were for this outcome," Jennifer said, her voice carrying genuine empathy alongside professional concern. "I want you to know that the agency is proud of the work you did on this case. The investigation was exemplary in its thoroughness and professionalism. You should feel good about what you accomplished here. Thank you, I said quietly. I appreciate that validation. It has been the hardest thing I have ever done professionally and personally, but I believe it was the right thing to do. It absolutely was the right thing, Jennifer confirmed. Those investors deserve justice and accountability. The fact that pursuing that justice required you to investigate your own father makes what you did even more admirable, not less. You put integrity and duty ahead of personal comfort and family loyalty. That takes extraordinary courage. We discussed the practical implications of the arrest for my ongoing role in the case. I would likely be called as a witness when the case went to trial, which meant I needed to be careful about any communications or actions that could be construed as witness tampering or inappropriate involvement in the prosecution. Jennifer also warned me that my father's defense team might file motions challenging my role in the investigation, or seeking to exclude evidence, based on alleged conflicts of interest. The U.S. Attorney's Office was prepared to defend against such challenges, but I should be aware that the legal proceedings might become personally uncomfortable as my family relationship was scrutinized and potentially weaponized by the defense. After the call with Jennifer ended, I tried to focus on other work matters but found my concentration fragmenting repeatedly. I kept refreshing news websites to see how the story was developing and whether any new information was being reported. By noon, several media outlets had posted more detailed articles including background on Thornton Development's business operations and interviews with legal experts analyzing the charges and potential penalties. One article mentioned that if convicted on all counts, my father faced up to 20 years in federal prison, a detail that landed with surprising emotional weight despite my intellectual understanding of the serious nature of the charges. At 1:30, my phone rang with a call from a number I recognized as belonging to my mother. I stared at the screen for several rings, debating whether to answer. Part of me wanted to avoid the confrontation entirely, to simply let the call go to voicemail and deal with whatever message she left at a time when I felt more prepared. But another part of me recognized that avoiding communication with my family indefinitely was neither realistic nor sustainable. I would have to face them eventually. Perhaps it was better to do so now on my own terms rather than waiting for them to corner me in some less controlled setting. I answered on the fifth ring. "Hello, Mother. How could you do this to us?" Her voice was raw with emotion, oscillating between rage and something that sounded like genuine anguish. "Your father was arrested this morning." "Arrested, Sarah. FBI agents came to our home at 7 in the morning and took him away in handcuffs. Do you have any idea what that was like? Do you have any comprehension of what you have done to this family?" I closed my eyes and took a slow breath, steadying myself for a conversation I had known was inevitable but had hoped to delay at least a few more days. "I did not do this to the family, Mother. I investigated evidence of securities fraud and testified truthfully to a grand jury about what I found. The arrest is a consequence of Dad's own criminal conduct, not my investigation of it." "You testified against your own father," she said, her voice rising with incredulity and condemnation. "You stood before a grand jury and told lies designed to destroy him. You betrayed your family, your name, everything we gave you and stood for. How can you live with yourself?" "I told the truth," I corrected firmly. "Not lies. The truth. And I can live with myself just fine because I know that what I did was right. Investors were defrauded. They deserve justice. The fact that the person who defrauded them happens to be my father does not change that fundamental reality." "He is your father," my mother repeated, as though saying it again would somehow make me understand the magnitude of my transgression. "He raised you, educated you, gave you every advantage and opportunity, and this is how you repay him? By destroying his life and his reputation? By trying to send him to prison?" "He destroyed his own life and reputation by committing fraud," I said, feeling my own anger rising to match hers. "I did not make him structure those transactions. I did not make him lie to investors. I did not make him create shell companies to inflate property values and misrepresent costs. He made those choices. He committed those crimes. And now he has to face the consequences of his actions. You are going to regret this," my mother said, her tone shifting from emotional pleading to cold threat. "You have made yourself an enemy of this entire family. We will fight you with everything we have." We will expose you as the vindictive, unstable person you really are. And when this is over, when your father is exonerated because the truth comes out about your fabricated evidence and personal vendetta, you will have nothing. No family, no reputation, no career. Nothing. The line went dead before I could respond, my mother having delivered her threat and hung up without waiting for any reply. I sat holding the silent phone for a long moment, processing the conversation and the naked hostility it had revealed. My mother had not called seeking understanding or reconciliation. She had called to deliver condemnation and warning, to make clear that I was now considered an enemy to be destroyed rather than a daughter to be reasoned with. I set the phone aside and walked to my window, looking out at the city and trying to ground myself in the present moment, rather than spiraling into anxiety about future conflicts. The confrontation with my mother had been unpleasant but not surprising. I had known that my family would close ranks around my father, would defend him regardless of the evidence, and would likely attack me in whatever ways they could devise. That knowledge did not make the experience of being on the receiving end of such hostility any less painful, but it did help me maintain perspective about what was happening and why. The rest of Saturday passed in a strange blur of phone calls I did not answer, news articles I compulsively refreshed, and attempts to focus on anything other than my father's arrest that uniformly failed. I tried to read a book but could not concentrate on the words. I attempted to work on a puzzle I had started weeks earlier but found the mindless activity unsatisfying rather than soothing. I considered going for a run but felt too emotionally depleted to summon the physical energy. Instead, I mostly sat in my apartment alternating between periods of restless anxiety and episodes of numb dissociation, waiting for the day to end so I could attempt sleep again. Rachel came over in the evening with takeout food and a bottle of wine, her presence providing the human connection I needed even though I was not particularly good company. We ate Thai food on my couch while watching a movie neither of us really paid attention to, the familiar comfort of her friendship anchoring me through the emotional turbulence. She did not try to force conversation or make me process feelings I was not ready to articulate. She simply existed in my space, available if I needed to talk but not demanding anything, offering the kind of support that came from years of deep friendship and intuitive understanding. Sunday morning brought a new development that shifted the media narrative in ways I had not anticipated. The Seattle Times published a lengthy investigative piece that went beyond the basic facts of the arrest to examine Thornton Development's business practices over the past decade. The reporters had interviewed several of my father's former business partners and investors, some of whom were willing to speak on the record about transactions they now viewed as suspicious in light of the criminal charges. The article painted a picture of a company that had operated in increasingly aggressive and ethically questionable ways as market conditions became more challenging, with my father willing to bend and ultimately break rules in pursuit of maintaining growth and profitability. One particularly damning section of the article included an interview with the whistleblower whose initial contact with the SEC had triggered the investigation. The whistleblower was identified only as a former employee of one of the shell companies involved in the fraudulent transactions, and they described becoming aware that the property purchases and resales were structured to deceive investors about actual costs and values. The whistleblower explained that they had initially raised concerns internally, but were told that the transactions were legal, and that they should not ask questions about matters beyond their responsibilities. When the concerns persisted and the whistleblower began to suspect criminal activity, they made the decision to contact the SEC despite fears of professional retaliation. Reading the whistleblower's account gave me a strange sense of kinship with this person I had never met in person. We had both recognized wrongdoing and made the difficult choice to report it despite the personal and professional risks involved. We had both prioritized integrity over loyalty to the people and institutions that employed us. And we had both faced the isolation and hostility that often comes with choosing to expose misconduct, rather than remaining silent. The whistleblower's courage in coming forward had initiated the investigation that led to my father's arrest, and my courage in continuing that investigation despite the family relationship had brought it to its conclusion. Together, we had ensured that fraud was exposed and accountability pursued. By Monday morning, the story had evolved beyond simple reporting of the arrest to include broader analysis of securities fraud in the real estate development sector and questions about regulatory oversight of private investment offerings. Several legal experts were quoted discussing the charges against my father and the likely trajectory of the case. Some noted that securities fraud cases can be difficult to prove because they require demonstrating not just that misrepresentations were made, but that the defendant knew they were false and intended to defraud investors. Others pointed out that the involvement of shell companies and offshore banks suggested a level of sophistication and planning that would make it harder for my father to claim the misrepresentations were innocent mistakes. I returned to work on Monday with a mixture of trepidation and relief, grateful to have professional responsibilities that would force me to focus on something other than my family situation. My colleagues at the SEC were uniformly supportive, offering congratulations on what they correctly perceived as a significant investigative success, while also being sensitive to the personal complications of the case. Several people mentioned that they admired my courage in continuing the investigation despite the family relationship, validation that helped counter the condemnation I was receiving from my biological family. Jennifer called me into her office mid-morning to discuss how the agency wanted to handle media inquiries and internal communications about the case. The SEC typically did not comment on ongoing investigations or prosecutions beyond the basic information provided in official press releases, but the high-profile nature of this case combined with my family connection created unusual circumstances that required careful management. We have received several media requests asking specifically about your role in the investigation, Jennifer explained. Reporters have figured out the family connection and want to know whether the SEC considers it appropriate for you to have investigated your own father. We are declining to comment on personnel matters, but you should be aware that your involvement will likely become a significant part of the story as it develops. I understand, I said, having anticipated that my anonymity would not last long. I am prepared for that attention. The investigation was conducted professionally and with appropriate oversight. I am confident it will withstand scrutiny. I am confident of that as well, Jennifer assured me. But confidence does not make the experience of being scrutinized any less unpleasant. You are going to face criticism and speculation about your motives. Some people will question whether you should have been involved in the case at all. Others will try to use the family relationship to undermine the evidence or create sympathy for your father. You need to be prepared for that and not let it shake your conviction about having done the right thing. We discussed strategies for managing the attention and maintaining professional boundaries. I would continue to refer all media inquiries to the SEC press office. I would avoid discussing the case on social media or in any public forums. And I would be careful about my communications with colleagues to ensure nothing I said could be misinterpreted as inappropriate involvement in the prosecution, now that the case had moved beyond the investigative phase. The week that followed the arrest established a new rhythm of daily stress and challenge that I had to learn to navigate, while maintaining some semblance of normal life. Each morning brought new media coverage of the case, with reporters digging into various aspects of Thornton Development's business operations and my father's history in commercial real estate. Several articles explicitly mention my role in the investigation, identifying me as the SEC investigator who had built the case against her own father. The coverage ranged from sympathetic portrayals of the difficult choice I had faced to more critical pieces questioning whether the investigation had been compromised by personal family dynamics. My father's first court appearance occurred on Tuesday, where he pleaded not guilty to all charges and was released on bond with conditions including surrender of his passport and restrictions on his business activities. The news coverage of the hearing included footage of my father entering and leaving the courthouse flanked by his attorneys, his face set in an expression of defiant confidence that I recognized from childhood as the mask he wore when determined not to show weakness or vulnerability. My mother and siblings were visible in the background of some shots, their presence a show of family solidarity that implicitly condemned my absence and my role in bringing the charges. The defense team wasted no time in beginning their public relations campaign, alongside their legal defense. Richard Castellano gave a statement outside the courthouse describing the charges as a travesty of justice, based on a misunderstanding of legitimate business transactions, and the misguided investigation of a family member with an axe to grind. He suggested that I had allowed personal grievances and family conflicts to cloud my professional judgment, leading to the misinterpretation of ordinary business practices as criminal fraud. The implication was clear. I was the problem, not my father's conduct, and the entire case should be viewed through the lens of dysfunctional family dynamics, rather than objective evidence of securities fraud. I watched the statement on the news that evening and felt my anger rise at the deliberate distortion of reality. There was nothing ordinary about creating shell companies to inflate property values and misrepresent costs to investors. There was nothing misguided about documenting systematic fraud with bank records, emails, and forensic accounting analysis. And there was nothing personal about my investigation beyond the unfortunate fact that the person who committed these crimes happened to be my father. But I knew that truth and effective legal strategy were not always the same thing, and I understood that my father's attorneys would continue to attack my credibility and motives as part of their defense, regardless of the facts. On Wednesday evening, I received an unexpected phone call from my Uncle Richard, my father's younger brother, who had sent me a supportive text message the night of the family dinner. I answered cautiously, uncertain what to expect from this conversation. "Sarah, I hope I am not calling at a bad time," Richard began, his voice carrying a hesitancy that suggested he was as uncertain about this conversation as I was. "I know things are incredibly complicated right now, but I wanted to reach out and talk to you if you are willing." "I am willing to listen," I said carefully, "though I should tell you that I cannot discuss the details of the case or my investigation." "I understand that," Richard assured me. "I am not calling to ask you about the case. I am calling because I want you to know that not everyone in the family believes the narrative that is being constructed about you. I have known you your whole life, Sarah. I know you are not vindictive or unstable or motivated by personal grudges. If you investigated your father and testified against him, I believe you did so because the evidence justified it." The unexpected support brought tears to my eyes that I blinked back quickly, determined to maintain composure. "Thank you, Uncle Richard. That means more than you know. The past week has been very isolating." "I can imagine," he said with genuine empathy. "The family has closed ranks around your father, which I understand on one level. He is my brother, and I love him despite his flaws. But love does not require blindness to wrongdoing, and loyalty should not mean defending the indefensible. I have had my own concerns about some of Gerald's business practices over the years, concerns I voiced to him privately but which he dismissed. So when I heard about the charges, I was shocked but not entirely surprised." We talked for nearly an hour, Richard sharing his own observations about my father's increasingly aggressive business tactics, and his own discomfort with some of the transactions he had become aware of through family conversations. He made clear that he could not publicly support me or my role in the investigation without creating an irreparable rift with my father and the rest of the family, but he wanted me to know privately that I had at least one family member who believed I had done the right thing. The conversation provided a measure of comfort that helped counter the isolation I had been experiencing. I was not entirely alone. I had Rachel's steadfast friendship, my grandmother's measured support, and now my uncle's private acknowledgement that my choices had been justified. These relationships could not replace the family structure I had lost, but they reminded me that I had not been wrong to prioritize integrity over family loyalty. The motivational truth crystallizing through these difficult days was one that would sustain me through the challenges ahead. Doing what is right often means standing alone against tremendous pressure to conform, to be silent, to prioritize institutional or family loyalty over justice and truth. The arrest of my father had transformed my private choice into public reality, exposing me to scrutiny, criticism, and hostility from people who had reason to want the truth suppressed. But I had withstood that pressure because my commitment to justice was stronger than my need for approval or acceptance. I had chosen to be the person who stood up rather than the person who looked away, and that choice defined who I was becoming even as it destroyed who I had been within my family structure. The courage required for this choice was not a single moment of dramatic action, but rather the daily discipline of continuing to move forward despite opposition, of maintaining conviction despite criticism, of standing firm despite isolation. Each day that I went to work and fulfilled my professional responsibilities despite media attention was an act of courage. Each time I refused to engage with hostile family members who sought to intimidate or manipulate me was an act of courage. Each moment I chose to trust the evidence and the process rather than succumbing to doubt or guilt was an act of courage. And those accumulated acts of daily courage, far more than any single testimony or confrontation, represented the true measure of integrity and strength. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.